U.S. General Langley secretly moves to eliminate Traore. He replies, "I am ready to die for Burkina Faso." They didn't issue a statement. They didn't send a warning. They just moved, in silence. A name circled in Washington, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Not a threat because of weapons. Not a threat because of war. But because he was waking up millions. He didn't beg. He didn't bend. He stood before cameras, calm as stone, and said, "I am ready to die for Burkina Faso." They called it reckless, but the people saw something else. If you believe a small nation can still stand tall against global power, if you believe Africa deserves to write its own story, in its own voice, if you saw the fire in Captain Traoré's eyes, then this story is yours too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support, but to walk together through a wave of awakening. A wave of pride. Of resistance. Of the new African spirit. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. It is what began as whispers turned into a quiet storm. The Pentagon had moved from watching to acting. General Langley didn't wait for permission. He'd warned Washington weeks earlier. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just holding power. He was holding something far more dangerous, hope. Not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent. Hope, Langley knew, was harder to kill than any man. And so the order was never written on paper. It didn't need to be. Operations shifted. AFRICOM operatives began moving into position, discreetly, without fanfare. Border checkpoints were reinforced under the guise of counter-terrorism training. In truth, they were tightening the noose. In neighboring regions, small surveillance stations appeared overnight. Satellite assets were redirected. Inside Burkina Faso, no one heard a gunshot. But things started breaking. First, the satellites' communications dropped without warning. Encrypted lines went dead. Presidential calls didn't go through. Then came the weapons. Shipments of essential arms were delayed due to paperwork. Vital contracts, previously honored, were suddenly re-evaluated. Pressure came from partners who claimed to still be allies, but their silence said otherwise. And Traoré knew. He didn't need to read a memo to know he was being boxed in. Burkina Faso was being isolated, not by embargo, but by erasure. It wasn't war. It was suffocation. On state media, his speeches were mysteriously cut for time. His diplomatic messages were returned unopened. A West African delegation scheduled to meet him abruptly cancelled. No reason given. Even African Union channels, usually slow to criticize, went quiet. The aim was clear: undermine him, question his leadership, make the world doubt, just long enough to make a hit seem justified. In Paris, a French columnist wrote, "Traoré is too young. Too unpredictable. He could destabilize the region." In Washington, a think tank released a policy brief titled, "Containing the Spread of Sovereignty." The message was buried in analysis, but its meaning was plain. They were building a case for removal. And yet, despite all that, something shifted, because not everyone stayed silent. It began, as it always does, with the youth. In Bamako, a university student spray-painted the phrase, "You cannot assassinate dignity." It was posted, reposted, reprinted. Within hours, it was a slogan. In Accra, a spoken-word artist uploaded a video called, "The Lion Does Not Ask Permission." The first line, "His silence shakes more walls than your bombs." In Kinshasa, a teacher printed out Traoré's speech, passed it to his students, and said, "Read this. Because you won't find it on television." And then came the murals. On highway walls, school gates, market stalls, painted eyes staring forward, eyes that looked just like Captain Ibrahim Traoré's. A storm was growing, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, Traoré refused to panic. but even he knew the pattern. He'd studied what happened to Lumumba, to Sankara, to Gaddafi. He knew what came after silence, what came before the bullet. Then came the message. It arrived not through official channels, but through a trusted voice. A friend. A contact. Someone with access to chatter most would never hear. They didn't write it down. They didn't need to. They're coming. That was all. And for a brief second, the air inside the presidential compound stood still. But Traore didn't call for evacuation. He didn't cancel appearances. He didn't even ask what the timeline was. He looked out the window, at the flag he'd sworn to protect. At the people walking in the dust, and he said, quietly, so be it. Back in Washington, another meeting was called. A low-lit room. A digital map on the wall, options laid out. Each one with risk assessments, but General Langley wasn't listening to risk. He wanted resolution. This will be over before anyone knows it started, he muttered. But outside the Pentagon, that wasn't true anymore. Because across the global south, across the African world, the silence had already broken. And in the corridors of African parliaments, whispers were changing shape. One analyst, sitting in a dusty office in Addis Ababa, put it plainly. This won't end the way Langley thinks. Because this time, there were too many eyes, too many ears, too many hearts that had already heard the call. A call to anyone who still believes in justice, freedom, and honor. He didn't blink. Not once. When the camera light turned red, when the world leaned in, waiting for panic or plea, Captain Ibrahim Traoré delivered neither. His voice was steady, low, but clear enough to shake continents. I know what they fear, he said. It's not my army. It's our awakening. Those words traveled fast. They crossed borders faster than any bullet. They reached people long forgotten by politics, long silenced by despair. But inside Burkina Faso's presidential compound, the atmosphere remained heavy. The intelligence was clear, an operation had been set in motion. Not public. Not official. But real. The kind of silence that always comes before a strike. He was given options. Retreat. Negotiate. Disappear. He rejected all of them. Instead, he summoned his media team. He asked for one broadcast. Live. Unedited. He didn't write a script. He didn't rehearse. He didn't even wear armor. He just spoke. It wasn't just a speech. It was a refusal to bend. A line drawn in dust and blood. And those watching knew, the captain had made his choice. He would not run. He would not hide. He would stand. The next day, the streets of Ouagadougou were unusually quiet. Shops had closed. Air was still. Even the birds seemed to pause. Then, footsteps. No armored convoy. No glass shields. Just Captain Ibrahim Traoré, walking. No bulletproof vest. No army surrounding him. A flag in his hand. Children by his side. Civilians stepped out silently. Some joined him. Some watched from windows. Some cried. It wasn't bravery in the cinematic sense. It was something deeper. Something quieter. A kind of defiance that didn't need weapons. He refused to cancel the rally. Refused additional protection. When his advisors begged, he shook his head. If I must die, he said, let it be where my people can see I never turned away. The world watched in silence. But in that silence, millions were moved. The shock spread fast. Some Western embassies quietly suspended meetings. Intelligence officials whispered of instability. But outside those glass offices, something else was happening. In Berlin, Paris, and Brussels, African diaspora communities filled the streets. Marching. Singing. Waving flags that hadn't flown in decades. In Johannesburg, Cape Town, Nairobi, his speech was projected onto buildings. Graffiti echoed his words. Awakening cannot be shot. Western governments didn't know how to react. Some labeled him dangerous. Others paused. Because when millions rally behind a man not asking for power, but defending dignity, even silence becomes political. He had exposed something. Not just about foreign policy, but about fear. The fear of a continent no longer asking. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people once more. No script. No teleprompter. Just the flag. And a microphone. If I fall, he said, pausing, bury me in the red earth of this land. He looked into the camera, into the soul of every child watching. But know this, I will not kneel. I was born free. I will die free. The words didn't need applause. They needed memory. And that night, across Africa, no one forgot. Twengon Din Chao that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people once more. No script. No teleprompter. Just the flag. And a microphone. If I fall, he said, pausing, bury me in the red earth of this land. He looked into the camera, into the soul of every child watching. But know this. I will not kneel. I was born free. I will die free. The words didn't need applause. They needed memory. And that night, across Africa, no one forgot. The silence didn't last. Because just when it seemed the storm might swallow him whole, something shifted. A message arrived. Not in a diplomatic pouch, not through encrypted channels, but in action, clear and defiant. Algeria was the first to move. Quietly, but decisively, it closed its airspace to all NATO-affiliated flights. No explanation given. No press conference. Just a statement that the skies above North Africa were no longer open to silent war. Then came Mali. Then Guinea. Then Chad. One by one, neighboring nations, once distant or hesitant, closed ranks. Intelligence sharing agreements were renewed overnight. Border surveillance shifted, not against Burkina Faso, but in its defense. In Moscow, murmurs turned to motion. The Russian Ministry of Defense publicly condemned the covert interference in African sovereignty. Russian jets, previously parked, were repositioned near the Sahel. And while no weapons fired, no statement was louder than the quiet presence of support where it mattered. But the most powerful response didn't come from governments. It came from people. In Dakar, tens of thousands gathered under storm clouds. Not for a concert. Not for a funeral. But to stand in the rain and chant one name, Traore. In Addis Ababa, young politicians who had once avoided the Burkina Faso debate now gave televised interviews. If they touch one of us, they touch all of us, one said. In the streets of Lagos, murals of Traore multiplied overnight, painted by youth who had never met him, but now wore his courage like armor. In Europe, the African diaspora refused to be silent. London. Marseille. Berlin. Brussels. Demonstrations formed without central leadership. Signs read, "You cannot kill what has awakened." Faced with this wall of human resistance, Washington shifted. A closed-door congressional hearing was scheduled. Leaks began to surface in American media. The operation was no longer deniable. AFRICOM's overreach, one headline read. Another, General Langley under scrutiny for Africa plan. Langley himself went silent. The very man who once called Traore a threat to stability now faced instability of his own making. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, Traore did not speak. He didn't boast. He didn't point fingers. He simply appeared, standing once more before his people, this time not to make a statement, but to hold a child in his arms. A child whose father had died defending a border. A child who didn't know geopolitics, but knew what safety felt like. The moment was captured in a photo. It went viral in minutes. Captioned with only 3 words, "He stood first." Across Africa, this moment became the turning point. Not just because of jets or borders or cancelled flights, but because an idea had crossed the point of no return. An idea that could no longer be crushed. One analyst in Nairobi put it best, the attempt to isolate Traore made him a beacon. The plan to silence him turned him into a signal. And so, what began as an assassination attempt became something else entirely. A mirror. A fire. A flag. And behind it all, a man who had once said, "I will die free," now stood, not alone, but surrounded by a continent that finally understood what he meant. In the days that followed, no airstrike came. No soldiers crossed the borders. But something far greater had already happened, an invisible line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once painted as a threat, now stood as something else, a symbol. A vessel. A living declaration. In Nairobi, schoolchildren were assigned essays titled, "Why I Want to Be Like Ibrahim." In Johannesburg, a rapper released a track using his last speech as the chorus. In Ghana, a muralist painted Traoré cradling the continent like a newborn child. His face, calm, weathered, defiant, now lived not just in newspapers, but in dreams. In African Union halls, the tone changed. Leaders who had once walked carefully now stood taller. Not in imitation, but in clarity. Africa, one delegate said, has stopped whispering. Western commentators tried to spin it. They called it populism. Theatrical. Temporary. But none of their words could erase the image of a man standing alone, with no army behind him, only truth. Burkina Faso began to change too. It wasn't a revolution of guns, but of spirit. Youth councils formed. Farmers refused corrupt contracts. Women's groups drafted new education policies. They didn't wait for permission. They moved. Meanwhile, Traoré remained quiet. He refused interviews. Declined celebrations. Instead, he returned to the villages. No cameras. Just conversations. Healing. Listening. Holding hands. But the world had already heard. And so, if you are hearing this now, wherever you are, know this. If you believe a small nation can still stand tall against global power. If you believe Africa deserves the right to shape its own destiny. If you saw that fire in the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Movie camera, then like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to walk beside us. Walk beside a rising wave of awakening. A wave of pride. Of resistance. Of the new African spirit. Raised fist. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. It is a call to anyone who still believes in justice, in freedom, and in honor. Together, we won't just witness history. We'll write it. In the days that followed, no airstrike came. No soldiers crossed the borders. But something far greater had already happened, an invisible line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once painted as a threat, now stood as something else, a symbol. A vessel. A living declaration. In Nairobi, schoolchildren were assigned essays titled, "Why I Want to Be Like Ibrahim." In Johannesburg, a rapper released a track using his last speech as the chorus. In Ghana, a muralist painted Traoré cradling the continent like a newborn child. His face, calm, weathered, defiant, now lived not just in newspapers, but in dreams. In African Union halls, the tone changed. Leaders who had once walked carefully now stood taller. Not in imitation, but in clarity. Africa, one delegate said, has stopped whispering. Western commentators tried to spin it. They called it populism. Theatrical. Temporary. But none of their words could erase the image of a man standing alone, with no army behind him, only truth. Burkina Faso began to change too. It wasn't a revolution of guns, but of spirit. Youth councils formed. Farmers refused corrupt contracts. Women's groups drafted new education policies. They didn't wait for permission. They moved. Meanwhile, Traoré remained quiet. He refused interviews. Declined celebrations. Instead, he returned to the villages. No cameras. Just conversations. Healing. Listening. Holding hands. But the world had already heard. And so, if you are hearing this now, wherever you are, know this. If you believe a small nation can still stand tall against global power. If you believe Africa deserves the right to shape its own destiny. If you saw that fire in the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Movie camera, then like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to walk beside us. Walk beside a rising wave of awakening. A wave of pride. Of resistance. Of the new African spirit. Raised fist. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. It is a call to anyone who still believes in justice, in freedom, and in honor. Together, we won't just witness history. We'll write it. Lessons from the story, the legacy of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's story teaches us that true leadership doesn't begin in palaces or end in parades. It begins in conviction and survives in sacrifice. His journey, from a young officer resisting imperial pressure to a continental symbol of courage, reveals that strength is not measured by missiles, but by moral clarity. Traoré never asked for fame. He didn't climb onto global stages begging for approval. He stood his ground when it was easier to flee. He spoke truth when silence might have spared him. He risked his life, not for a headline, but for a principle, that Burkina Faso, like any other land, had the right to chart its course without asking for permission. What makes his story unforgettable isn't just his resistance. It's how he did it, with no theater, no theatrics, no vengeance. Just purpose. Calm. Steadiness. A belief that dignity could not be negotiated. When others might have chosen exile or compromise, he chose to walk through the streets of Ouagadougou unguarded. With a flag in one hand and children by his side, he reminded the world that sovereignty isn't something granted, it's something lived. His refusal to kneel wasn't a rejection of diplomacy. It was a defense of truth. We live in a world that often confuses visibility with power. But Captain Traoré's example flips that equation. Power, he showed us, is the ability to move people, without manipulation. To shift nations, without occupation. To spark revolutions, without firing a shot. The lesson is clear, real leadership flows from inner integrity. It isn't built on fear, but on faith. Faith that people, when given honesty and courage, will rise. And they did. Across Africa, from street artists to senators, people stood, not just for him, but because of him. His quiet defiance became a blueprint. His speeches became scripture. His name, once spoken only in Burkina Faso, now lives on murals, music, and memory. We learn, too, that resistance is not always loud. Sometimes it is calm. Sometimes it is a man refusing to flinch while warplanes circle overhead. Sometimes it is a leader choosing to heal villages instead of gloating on world stages. In Captain Traore, we see not just a president, but a prototype. Of what Africa could be if it no longer bowed. Of what leadership looks like when it no longer waits for permission. So the next time someone asks what leadership means, show them this story. And if they ask what hope sounds like, say his name. Ibrahim Traoré.